I really don't know how I feel about Surrender of the Pink. I need to say, first of all, that I am madly in love with Carrie Fisher. I absolutely love her. I always think that she has a very creative writing style. That's absolutely the case with this. This is actually the last of her books that I had to read. I've read them all now, so I can kind of weigh up the quality of this against the quality of some of her other books. And arguably, I shouldn't have to do that, but I kind of feel like this is one of her weakest. The narrative isn't the best fleshed out. It kind of neglects most of the characters after the first half. Yes, it's important for narratives to move forward and bring in new characters, but if you're introducing characters in the beginning that don't later on actually have any meaning, and they don't add any meaning to the bit when they're in it, you kind of need a reason for that. I'm speaking as a writer. If I brought in characters and then didn't do anything with them, I'd be questioned why I was doing that. As a character study for Dinah, it works quite well, and I will explain about Dinah in a minute, but I will also say I'm not going to say how it ended. I absolutely won't ruin that, but I was not satisfied with it. I did not feel like it ended in the right way. And that's not just with what I wanted or what I had hoped, but I feel like the ending was a bit of a cop-out almost, and not really true to what the narrative was leading up to or what Dinah would have done. I just didn't really think the ending was very satisfying. And by the ending, I am talking the last kind of 4 or 5 pages. Before that, I actually kind of really got into it. And the first half was a bit meh. Most of the second half, I actually began to become emotionally invested in it, and then I felt a little let down. Surrender of the Pink. Pink refers to Dinah's virginity, and it starts off talking about the first time she lost her virginity, and then the second time, which doesn't make sense, but actually when you read it, Dinah explains what she means by this. And eventually we get to know Dinah in the present day. She's a screenwriter, she writes for a soap opera, and she's kind of pining after her ex. And things didn't necessarily work out there, but there's an opportunity for reconciliation. But things don't necessarily work out there either, and then there are glimmers of hope here and there, and it's basically all about how she responds to these various men in her life, and how she responds to relationships, both real and fantasized. And it's about this one woman's relationship with sex, physical relationships, romantic relationships, and the concept of love in general. And it is interesting enough to follow Dinah's journey. She's a likable enough character, but she's inconsistent. For example, she explains at the beginning that she names her moods Roy and Pamela. This is definitely Carrie Fisher speaking from her heart, because as we learned in later years, when she started to reveal more about her personal life for whatever reason, we learn that Carrie Fisher actually named her moods, the various ends of bipolar, but nothing is really done with that with this character. So there's no real reason for the character to explain this, because we don't really see that element of her. So why did she tell us this? It's kind of unnecessary fluff, and this happens quite a lot. We learn something potentially interesting about the character, and then nothing is done with that. So it's like we're given information unnecessarily, and unfortunately this does happen quite a lot. And I feel like it's probably just cathartic for Carrie when she was writing this, putting elements of herself in there, elements that at the time the reader wouldn't have known were elements of her. So from her perspective, I can completely see why she'd do that. But from a writing perspective, the character could have been so much more interesting. She could have done so much more. But part of me thinks maybe she was... I was going to say maybe she was scared to do that, but other books that Carrie had written before this were a lot more personal and a lot more... filled with a lot more of her own personal truth. So I don't think that was necessarily the case. I do feel like it was just kind of a badly written character, to be perfectly honest. But at the same time, she was also well written, because there were small things like picking her thumb and little habits that kind of gave us a deeper insight into kind of maybe a kind of neuroticism or a disconnection that this character has with the world around her, which doesn't seem like it makes much sense when I'm just saying it like that. But when you read it, there are bits of this character that I think are well developed and well fleshed out. But there are tidbits that we are given that nothing is then done with, and it is filler, it is fluff, and unfortunately there's quite a lot of that. The narrative itself, as I said, it's kind of a book of two halves. Once she goes to a certain location and she meets her neighbor, it changes. The focus changes, the tone kind of changes, which is absolutely fine. That's kind of the point when I became interested in the character, and it felt a bit more consistent. And the writing style felt more consistent. The characters' behaviors felt more believable, consistently believable. There is one episode that I loved. I feel like it worked very well, and it involved the shoes in the cupboard. I won't say any more than that, but I thought that was interesting. Maybe gave us a little look into her mental health a bit more, Dinah's mental health, that is. But I feel like, again, more could have been done with that character to make it more interesting. So, if you're a fan of Carrie Fisher, I'd say read it, because it's interesting given what we know now about her personality, how much of her is injected in this one. Actually, out of all of her books, I feel like this is the least autobiographical, based on what I know. Apparently, according to Wikipedia, it is very loosely based on her marriage to Paul Simon, which, yeah, I kind of figured there would be elements of her own relationships in this, and I feel like when we get to meet Dinah's mother in this, which is not that frequent, yes, I can see that being elements of Debbie Reynolds, but I don't feel like it's as heavily autobiographical as some others. At least, not with what we know about her, anyway. But it's worth a read if you're a fan of Carrie Fisher. If you're just looking for a good book, by all means give it a go, but I don't think it wasn't that great. After the first half, I found it to be really, really, not really enjoyable, that's too much, but engaging enough. But compared to some of her other books that are actually really kind of compelling and gripping and well written, it's a bit of a letdown. And it's a shame that's the last of her books I've had to read, but at the same time I'm glad I didn't start with it, because then there would have been the risk of me then judging the rest against this one and being kind of prejudiced against the others, if you like, because I'd constantly be looking at them with this in mind. Surrender the Pink is not a brilliant book. It's not brilliantly written. Dinah as a character is sometimes well written and sometimes not. Give it a go if there's anything about it that's pulling you towards it, but I wouldn't recommend you put it to the top of your to-read pile. And if there are other Carrie Fisher books that you haven't read yet, I'd say prioritise some of the other ones first. I will at some point do a ranking of all of her books, which ones I recommend the most. Needless to say, Surrender the Pink is not my favourite.